Good. Well, we have a good audience today. Welcome everyone, good morning everyone, and welcome to the UK Pavilion for National Grid session, looking at the critical role of electricity grids in delivering a clean, fair, affordable energy transition while continuing to ensure the security of supply. So this is going to put it there. My name is Guy van Nieuwenhove, and I'm the Director of Portfolio Management for National Grid Ventures. For those who are less familiarized with National Grid is span across UK and US, and National Grid Ventures invest in clean energy infrastructure. Examples of that would be subsea cables interconnecting UK and European countries, and in the US we also developing onshore solar, offshore wind, renewables in general. I'm delighted here today to have a panel of experts. And I'm going to come back to introduce you properly. Before we do that, I just want to give you a little context in terms of what we're looking from today. So I think from a European perspective, I think it's fair to say that we've seen some geopolitical events that has really exposed the over-reliance that we have on probably insecure, volatile fossil fuel supply. So I think it's essential that we transition to a resilient and sustainable energy system where obviously that is at the core. It's not just about environmental benefits, but it's also about alleviating the soaring energy prices and obviously the competitiveness of economies. So, I mean, probably you've heard this before, but there is no energy transition without transmission. And I think it's important that we recognize, especially in national grid markets in the UK and US, we see the need to accelerate investment to get the electricity grids ready to underpin the transition to a highly electrified energy system, and also to allow the integration of renewable-based energies. So there's a lot of investment planning, and we need to build out the scale. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists today. So on the left, we've got Lisa Jacobson, who is the President for Business Council for Sustainable Energy. This is a 55-member trade association representing energy efficiency, natural gas, and renewable energies industry. So thank you very much for joining us today. So looking forward to get your perspective, especially on policy, as we cover today. Rob McDonnell, Managing Director for SSE Transmission, and obviously you cover a number of roles within SSE in terms of legal compliance and large capital projects. So delighted to have you today to join us in this discussion. And Diala Hawila, who is representing IRENA, International Renewables Energy Agency, mainly focused on policy advice and in the Knowledge and Policy Finance Center. So with that, I think that I'm probably going to start with first question, maybe with Rob, if that's okay. So we made, Rob, in Europe, from a Europe perspective, we made a very, in UK and Europe, we made these ambitious targets, we set these ambitious targets by 2030, and to deliver net zero, relying on renewables. I mean, with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, the Ukraine-Russian crisis, how realistic do you think these targets are in terms of the ones that have been set, and what are the challenges you see with respect to both onshore and offshore transmission?
Wow, big question to get us started. I'm actually pretty optimistic, Guy. I really am. I mean, there's no doubt that the targets are daunting. These are huge numbers. If I talk about my own system, just in the north of Scotland, we're an 8 gigawatt system currently. To be on a net zero pathway, we need to be about 15, 16 gigawatts. So I nearly doubled by the middle of the decade, and about 24 gigawatts by 2030. So we need to double the network by the middle of the decade, treble it by the end of the decade. So huge, huge challenge. But these are things we've done before. You know, these are onshore reinforcements. We've done them before. We know what they do. We know what the technology is. And offshore reinforcements, and similarly, we've got the track record. So to me, it's about scale. So to the second part of your question, what's the biggest challenge? It's how we scale up. And the key to that, in my mind, is getting early certainty about the particular projects and the plan, so we can engage with the supply chain and build that out in good order. They'll be the key things I'd highlight, Guy.
Thank you. So optimistic, we've done it before, and the challenge is obviously on scaling up. If I then move to, and that's obviously a great perspective from UK and Europe. Lisa, in the last year, we've seen significant ambition shown by the Biden administration. And I mean, we're culminating with the, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is promising hundreds of billions of dollars to support. Some observers say that that's a little bit thin on the transmission side. And do you have any perspectives in terms of what are the challenges that you see with the US with respect to delivering the required transmission? And perhaps you're sharing any of perspectives in terms of the different layers of regulatory in terms of federal, state, that is a little bit different than in other UK and European countries?
Well, first, hello. Hi, can you hear me? Okay, good. Thank you. Wonderful to be here, and also wonderful to be partnering with National Grid. National Grid serves as our current chair for the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. So a lot of questions there, and I don't want to speak too long. So maybe I'll just start by echoing what we just heard. I mean, to meet the U.S. clean energy goals as laid out by the Biden administration and what's in our nationally determined contribution, I mean, basically we have to quadruple our renewable energy capacity, and that is going to require major amounts of new transmission, because a lot of times where we anticipate building the transmission will not be where the load is. So a very similar story to what we just heard. In the United States, the decision making is multi-layered. I mean, there is a strong role for the federal government, and that may be evolving, and we could talk about that a little bit maybe in a follow-up question. But decision making on siting and permitting and building out of electric transmission happens really at the bottom up and the top down all at once. You know, there are regulatory processes at the state level, at the local level, and then there are many federal requirements. And in some parts of the United States, there's also regional participation in the process. The challenge is these things take a really long time. I mean, we're talking 5, 10 years, and picking up on a comment that was just made, the economics of those projects when they are first planned may change. So we need a process that moves quickly because we have an urgent need to bring that renewable energy and other clean energy resources to load areas. But we also need to be mindful that economics change, and we certainly have been seeing inflation, talking about 8% inflation. That's going to impact the cost of a particular project and may make some things that were economic 10 years ago or 5 years ago no longer possible. So we need to move fast, number one, because we need the load, but we also need to be mindful as businesses that things change the longer these projects are in the pipeline. The Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, 2 major bills, actually it's the 1-year anniversary of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passing, provide a number of grant programs to states and local governments to facilitate planning and build out and modernization of the electric grid. I mean, I was just tallying it up this morning before this event, at least over $3 billion there. But the need is much greater. And also, we were hopeful that we would get a production tax credit for a transmission in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was just passed over the summer. There were a number of new tax credits included, and we were hopeful that that would be in it. So that may be why you're hearing from some that it could have been a little more robust. But nonetheless, I mean, there's tremendous enthusiasm and momentum coming out of both of those bills. And in a follow-up question, I'm happy to talk about the federal regulatory process that's underway, which also will impact our ability to build transmission. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And yes, I mean, the decision-making process is certainly different, so it'd be good to sort of talk a little bit about that afterwards as well. And I think you're making a great point here in terms of managing the economics as well as the pace at which we need to mobilize projects today. I do think that these type of initiatives like IIJA and IRA will certainly help to share that risk initially, and I think they're great incentives to mobilize projects. Any other thoughts on Lisa? Otherwise, I am probably going to sort of shift to perhaps provide a slightly different perspective, more sort of global perspective, sort of Diala. So you've recently, Irina, recently published a renewable power report that shows that there's a huge amount of concentration in Asia, and the sort of, or half of the capacity will be concentrated in Asia, North America and Europe. Whereas in comparison, when you look at the renewable capacity in places like Middle East, North Africa and the Sub-Saharan Africa, that's down to 2% respectively. So obviously a significant difference. So I was wondering if you can share a little bit of your perspectives in terms of what could unlock the potential, because of course those regions have a huge potential in renewables. And again, what are the challenges that you see them facing in terms of developing the transmission infrastructure?
Yes, thank you, Guy. So we published the report last week on renewable energy targets and NDCs, and we quantified the renewable energy targets in the power sector globally. So what we find is that by 2030, the world is aiming to install around 5.4 terawatts. So we would be up to 5.4 terawatts of installed capacity. We are at 2021, we are at 3.1. So already that's not very ambitious. But in order to stay within the 1.5 degree scenario, as per IRENA's 1.5 degree scenario, we need to be at 10.8. So already, globally, we are at half of the ambition where we need to be by 2030 in terms of installed capacity. Now, looking into those numbers, looking into that total and where it is by regions, we see that, as you mentioned, a lot of it is in Asia, and when we say Asia, it's 87% China. So you have all of the Southeast Asia region that is not aiming for a large capacity or a percentage of the total. The rest is in Europe and North America. And then we see that in the MENA region, which is in big need of electricity for supply reasons, security of supply reasons, and for other reasons, the region is aiming for only 3% of the total, and Sub-Saharan Africa has 2% of the total ambition. So this doesn't mean that those regions are not ambitious because they choose not to be ambitious. It means that they are restricted with a lot of barriers. So those are not regions and countries that lack the ambition, but they rather lack the means for ambition. So this is why we look at the need for public investment and international cooperation, multilateral development banks, financing institutions that can help deploy the grids and the transmission lines needed to support this energy transition. So also according to IRENA's 1.5 degree scenario, we will need investments in grids and energy flexibility in general of around $600 billion a year between 2021 and 2030. And between 2030 and 2050, this is going to go back up to increase to $775 billion a year. Between 2017 and 2019, we were at $275 billion a year. So globally, we need to more than double our investments in grid and in energy flexibility. So we will talk about other flexibility mechanisms in a minute. So it's not only investments in new grids or upgrades in grids, there's also other policy design that we can do around it. But grid investments or grid availability remains a major barrier in a lot of the developing world. And especially that in this part of the world, we don't have cost-reflective tariffs all the time. So it makes it very difficult to make transmission lines economically beneficial. So this is where we need more public investments and international cooperation to support renewable energy deployment.
Thank you very much. Some of these numbers are gigantic, and it's interesting to note these sort of, we're doing well overall, but the level of concentration in a single country and how that sort of distorts a little bit of the reality that other regions are facing. So thanks for sharing that. And also the scale of these sort of over 700 billion needed. And also, I think it's these, sometimes we think about sort of transmission, only thinking about sort of the requirements for the infrastructure, for the wires, but there's a huge need to focus on flexibility as well. So it was an important highlight. So thank you for that. I think if we move to, based on our experience in the US and Europe, I mean, there is no shortage of ambition, and I think you touched on this, Diala, already. There's no shortage of ambition and will to deliver the scale of the commitments. But it is critical that we get the right policy in place and regulatory frameworks to make it happen. So, question for all, you can take it in whatever order you want, but what do you think governments can do to really help deliver that required transmission infrastructure? Anyone?
My answer will be a bit long. So
Okay.
at IRENA, we look at policies from a very comprehensive point of view. So deployment policies, which we always talk about, like auctions or feed-in tariffs, they're just part, or tax credits, they're just part of the puzzle. So we look at enabling policies, which is, for example, one of them is investments in infrastructure, or risk mitigation instruments to support investments in renewables and other also energy transition related investments. Capacity building, so building the skills needed, and for example, raising awareness about the importance of renewables. So we put all of these into enabling policies. Now we have integrating policies, and integrating policies include investments or supporting investments in transmission and grid, but it also includes, as I mentioned, the design of flexibility, of the design of policies that can support integration of renewables into the system that go beyond building new grids. Like, for example, when we design an auction, we can design it in a way to ensure that the projects that are built in areas that are close to grid connections. This is just one example. And then we look at the structural change that is needed, including the redesign of current power systems, but we can talk about this later, it's a long topic. And the fourth category is what I mentioned before, the international cooperation and support that we need. So money that will flow from the global north to the global south to support the public investments in grids and other enabling frameworks. So.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Diala made an excellent point earlier about networks are an afterthought, I think, in a lot of jurisdictions and policy-making terms. And so my answer to your question would be more focus on networks, in particular a clear plan for what you want the networks to deliver going out 7, 8, 9, 10 years, right down to a project level. Because typically large-scale, billions of pounds offshore projects, you know, they typically take 8 to 10 years from being a twinkle in a planner's eye to the minister unveiling the plaque. Now, you go figure then, if we want to do all these things by 2030, we need that certainty now, I think. So that would be my first ask. And secondly, for governments to get all of their various institutions right behind net zero, right behind the plan, whether that's central government, local government, regulators, planning authorities, all behind delivering net zero if we're going to achieve these very ambitious goals.
And I think from the United States side, we definitely need clarity on the process and reform of the process, and that's what's going on right now. So in addition to the facilitative and investment side that we're seeing through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, there needs to be reforms to our regulatory processes to make it clear and also make it much more efficient. So right now at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is our body that can help in this area, there's a pretty extensive reform process, multi-year process underway to look at a number of issues that are challenging us with relation to transmission expansion and modernization. But underpinning that multi-year process is the tension between state, local, and federal policymakers. We value local authority, and we're trying to find a way to move forward and overcome barriers, but also retain local and state authorities over these decisions. So I think still a lot of education is needed, kind of back to your point. There is increasing alignment with the net zero goals across the country, but when it comes to building something, we're still struggling with kind of how are we going to make an economic model that is appropriate given who is benefiting from these expansions or investments in infrastructure. And that's not only for electric infrastructure. You know, you can look at many energy sector infrastructure projects and we'll have that same question. Who pays and why, and who gets the benefits and why? And I think there's a growing recognition that we all need new transmission to meet our renewable energy goals, but we're still struggling with figuring out the governance that's fair and equitable about how we're going to pay for it. So the federal investments are incentives, as you said. They help move people forward more quickly, make things more economically attractive, and they reduce risk, but they're not paying for the project. And we don't really need much more, you know, because we have a strong appetite on the capital side for these projects. We're just getting stuck in the permitting and siting process and the multiple layers that it takes to actually make a transmission line finally make it to benefit our consumers. So the last thing I would say is there's great focus in this conference and in the United States on community involvement and community engagement and a place-based approach, right? So again, it goes back to working with communities and helping to share with them what's required if they would like to have renewable and clean energy, and making it in their interest so that they'll be, you know, more open to the conversation if infrastructure projects need to be in their jurisdiction.
Thank you, and I'll come back to communities in a while, but I think we've heard quite a broad range of comments here, covering everything from we need sort of multi-layers of lenses in terms of regulatory frameworks, underpinning business models that are sustainable, more focus on networks, and on the planning, bearing in mind that some of these are 10-year requirements, and I think clarity on the process, and to the point of looking for reforms all the way in the US. And I think it's very interesting, again, to highlight this difference in terms of the multi-layer decision-making process and the alignment between federal, state, and local, which is a little bit different in some of the UK and European countries. So with that, I'm going to move to another topic, which I think is also important, particularly in Europe. So everyone is talking about supply chain, particularly because of this. We talked about the concentration in China and sort of Asia really driving some of the growth. So what is that creating elsewhere in the world? So would you mind sharing any perspective in terms of where do you see supply chain challenges impacting the delivery of the transmission infrastructure?
I'm happy to start for this one. Look, I think we're clear that we're asking a lot of the supply chain to step up. I talked before about for my own network. I don't think it's that unusual, but we're going to have to double and treble the network in a little over 7 years. And the supply chain internationally doesn't currently exist to allow not just us, but everybody else to do that all at the same time. We're all after the same things in the same timescales. But to me, the key to all this is to get that long-term plan I mentioned earlier. Because if we can get certainty, and the UK is on the cusp of doing this actually, I think it should be a huge step forward for us. We're getting approval for all our projects through to 2030. We can then engage with the supply chain and allow them in turn to make the investments they need to make, whether that's new cable factories, new infrastructure, whatever. But we need the certainty now so we can feed that through into the supply chain. It also has benefits for the community points. I think you've very rightly raised that we can have a richer conversation with communities if they've got a sense of what we're looking to do over the long term rather than project by project. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to build up on what Rob was saying, yes, long-term plans, targets are very important in order to mobilize all the players. So in terms of long-term planning, so it has to account for everything: the power sector, electrification of end uses, energy efficiency plans, urban expansion plans. So it's really a cross-sectoral process, and also education and to build the capacity needed. Now to go to supply chain, so once this direction is provided, the long-term direction, shorter term to medium to short term to 2030, and then long-term to 2050. Once this direction is provided to the market, we also need to design policies that can support local supply chain development. So the reason we are where we are today is because we have been focusing and obsessing a lot about price and policy design, especially with the competitive procurement mechanisms, which is what we focus a lot on IRENA, on analyzing. And since we started analyzing competitive procurement mechanisms for renewable energy projects, we were talking about designing these auctions in a way that supports local industrial development, but we were talking about it mostly from a socioeconomic benefits perspective. So we wanted to maximize the benefits of localizing value chains, and we talked a lot about policies, industrial policies that can localize value chains. But back then it was a bit difficult to talk about the topic, especially with regards to World Trade Organization rules and free competition. So it was more difficult than today to talk about localizing value chains. But we would always like to stress about the importance of designing policies in a way that can support supply chains, and in that sense, not focusing always on reduced price, because that will always lead us to importing equipment from the same countries. So maybe focusing more on building the local value chains so that they are there when we need them. Because now when we compress them and they don't make enough money, it's not worth investing in those plants. So now they're not there when we need them.
That's really. I'm sorry, Lisa. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I was just going to point out that the Inflation Reduction Act, the bill that includes $370 billion in our tax credits, doesn't include a electric transmission production tax credit, but many others that are in the renewable energy sector, and they require many opportunities for bonus credits for domestic production, domestic manufacturing, workforce issues. So it is trying to do that on a national level in the United States, and right now we're in the process of really writing those specific rules, because they were just articulated in the legislation, but they didn't have any implementing guidance. So we're in the process now of trying to write those, and hopefully in the next several months they'll be final. But that we need safe, secure supply chains, and also there is an interest, especially from the Biden administration, to have economic benefit in the United States in terms of investment and job creation. So it's a really exciting time and a very new set of circumstances, because as you said, I mean, the focus before was just get those costs down, and now with new levels of ambition, it's a whole new conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, yes.
I think there's somewhat of a virtuous circle here, that if we can get a long-term plan for the networks, that allows us to have local content. I think you're absolutely right. That'll lead to more resilient supply chains. They'll be able to respond to demand shocks. But I think that's also important from a community perspective, because we can get people to buy in if they can see that it's local jobs rather than jobs going abroad. It's much easier. So it feels to me there's a virtuous circle here if we get this right.
I think there's a great introduction to the next question. I think we talked about the certainty. I think it was important to highlight this holistic approach. It's not just infrastructure. I mean, it's everything else, energy efficiency, and then the incentives, obviously, as IRA, as the example of really anchoring some of that opportunity. So moving to communities then, would you mind sort of sharing, I guess, your perspective in terms of how do you bring communities along? And I think, Rob, you started to share an example of that. How do you bring them along in this journey so that they're part of the solution with
so firstly, I think this is absolutely vital. I think the points Lisa made were absolutely on point. We're asking a lot of the local communities. We're asking not just as a supply chain, but of local communities, because we're going to be putting in an awful lot of infrastructure. My company's going to be investing somewhere like £10 billion in the north of Scotland. You know, that's a lot of towers, that's a lot of substations. And we need, therefore, to engage with communities. To me, that means being transparent as well, and meaningful engagement, two-way engagement, which means we adjust our plans on the back of what we hear. And just to give you an example of that, at our last price setting review with our regulator, we published our entire plan with costs for every project and allowed people to then make meaningful decisions about, what do you want that to go ahead, left a bit, right a bit, etc., rather than, I think, some engagements that we've seen by some of our peers in the sector, and we'll perhaps not name names, you know, where the consultation's been, this is the project, what colour do you want it painted? You know, it's not real meaningful engagement. So I think being transparent, real engagement, and being ready to adjust our plans in response to what we hear, so people can see that there's a point to them engaging with you, because it's a two-way thing. I think this is really, really important given the scale of what we're wanting to do if we want to get a collective view about the projects to take forward.
Any other thoughts on the communities?
Yeah, I just echo what Rob just said, and just to add to it, also distributing some of the benefits. So local engagement, definitely, and distributing the benefits. So we see some projects that give back to the communities, either in terms of building public schools or healthcare centers, or definitely providing jobs, more benefits into the community in general. But yeah, for example, when it comes to the grids and transmission lines, they will pass by a lot of communities that will be not paying for it, but they will be affected by these grids. So considering that, and in addition to engaging them, also providing some of the benefits to them would be essential.
I agree. I mean, all that was said. I've seen, you know, you see those through these projects. I mean, there needs to kind of be a systemic set of practices, and we're all learning and now we're going to be doing many more projects, so there'll be a lot of lessons learned. But I remember about 10 or 15 years ago having the opportunity to work with one of our members on some, this is not transmission, though it involved transmission, you know, some of the first very large-scale solar projects in California. And I think the biggest takeaway that I took from meeting the people that were involved in that outreach, because there was a lot of local opposition at the time, it was on private lands, and some were interested, some were not. It was just a consistency of engagement. I mean, it took many years, and they're still, you know, very involved in those communities. I think there's a trust building element. There needs to be an authentic, you know, kind of partnership approach. And for some communities that have not had positive experiences with infrastructure, you know, they're rightly very skeptical. So, I mean, there's no, you know, magic solution here. Every project is going to have its own dynamics, but I think, again, what I took away was really the seriousness and true long-term commitment to these communities that's needed, and that only really is evident over time.
Thank you. Sorry, Rob, you want to say something, Rob? No. Oh. No, I think it's great. I mean, on one hand, we're asking a lot from them, and then, of course, then there is a real need to engage not only for the short term, but also in the long term, and do that in a true sort of partnership sort of approach. So that's a key takeaway from this. So I think that we cover a lot. We talked about some of the challenges we're facing, where we see government can help, and what are the sort of the challenges and barriers. We also sort of talked a little bit about supply chain, the reality of how do we bring communities with us. We're quite lucky to have a very sort of a big audience today, so I was wondering if we might have the opportunity, if there is interest, to ask any questions maybe from the audience. I'm looking around. Anyone who might want? Oh, good one.
Thank you. Partly, this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you. There's partly a question about the emerging markets side, and I think Diana, you were talking about the essential need for public investment, but then the scale of money needed is kind of much larger than what you'll be able to mobilise on a public side. So, what are the things that you can do to really enable that mobilisation of private money into grid systems in emerging markets?
Yes, thank you for the question. So it's very convenient at COP because we are really asking the global north to send money to the global south. And we've been waiting for this for years now. The commitments every year are not met. So this is one area where we want to continue pushing, and specifically this money would go into investing in such public infrastructure like grids. Apart from that, mobilizing private investments into the sector is a bit challenging because of so many, as we said, it's a mix of factors and a mix of policies. So one thing that we continue seeing in emerging markets is that the tariffs are not very cost reflective. So this is why there is high risk of investing in projects or in infrastructure. And so the way that we have been looking at risk mitigation has been really focused on just a few instruments. And every time we talk about risk mitigation, the first thing we talk about is guarantees, sovereign guarantees, which is not possible in those countries that are already defaulting. So we just keep on turning around in circles. I think the next step is for us to figure out ways to mitigate those risks that go beyond guarantees, and to think about innovative solutions and innovative policies that can support that. So having said that, we can see some case studies, some examples of, I spoke a lot about the competitive procurement of renewables, or auctions or tenders. This is what we focus a lot on. And as I mentioned at IRENA, we do a lot of work on designing them or analyzing their design in a way that does mitigate risk. And mitigate risk means the risk will always be there, the costs are always going to be there. It's just assigning them to the party that is most capable of handling that risk in that particular context. So in that sense, you can design your auction in a way to support system integration in cases where you can without expanding the grid. As I mentioned, you can incentivize projects to be closer to the grid. Or in emerging markets with high risks, we talk about site-specific projects. So you auction projects in specific sites that you know are closer to the grid. In that sense, also we talk about design of auctions to support local communities. So it's either in the qualification requirements that you would give back to the community, or in the selection process. So you put scores that are related to how you benefit the community, or scores related to how well you can integrate into the grid. So there are different ways of designing policies in those contexts. We see, for example, cases like the projects in Morocco that had a lot of support from multilateral development banks that were site-specific, that gave back to the community. We see some cases also for the scaling solar that we saw in Zambia and in other African countries. So there are some case studies and some success projects that we can look at. Definitely we cannot replicate them because we don't replicate policies. Every context requires its own design. But there are some things that we can look at to start thinking outside of the box and outside of just guarantees to mitigate risks.
That was really comprehensive. That was no, but it was really helpful. I mean, it was I was listening with a lot of interest. Any other question? We covered different topics, different areas. Just looking around. Or any final remarks, maybe from the panelists? Anything you want to add?
Just a quick point, really. I just look after the north of Scotland, so we have a very sort of parochial view of things. And just from my perspective, it's great to hear that internationally we're all facing similar challenges. And I just one takeaway is how do we get that better cooperation, that better learning? Because rather than reinventing it all in our respective jurisdictions, would be my takeaway.
Thank you.
My only other point would be an emphasis on resilience as being an opportunity to engage more communities in transmission modernization and upgrades, and also this conversation about ancillary services or flexible services on the grid. I mean, again, this larger process I mentioned under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is more expansive opportunity to address all of those issues that have been addressed in a small way over many years, but we really haven't made the changes that are needed. But I think in thinking about transmission investments and community adoption, if we are able to make sure it's really holistic and looking at other community values, and I know the economic value for ancillary services or flexibility valuation, as well as resilience planning and investment, might be very attractive. So that would be my last point.
Thank you. Dale, do you have final remarks?
Yes, I very much agree with Rob and Lisa. And just to add just one final thing, the structural change that we need policies that are a bit more progressive, because so far all the policies that are implemented are benefiting the higher income people. We need policies that are more progressive in a sense that when we invest in a grid, people who will most benefit from this investment are people who use it the most, so they're the higher income people. And this is the case for all of our policies. So we need to start also thinking of policies that are more progressive that can benefit everybody equally.
Thank you very much. So I think there's a lot of themes coming out from today's discussion. I think certainty, long-term certainty was certainly quite high up. I think alignment across different layers of decision making as well. Creative policy, progressive policy, not only to mitigate risks, but also to unlock other global regions that also need to access and be part of the energy transition, as we talked about. And then finally, I think we spent a lot of time talking about the role of bringing communities along with us. So I thought, thank you very much again, Lisa, Rob, and Dela. I think it was a great discussion today. And thank you very much to the audience as well.